Hello, this is Michael Stone, the host of We Earth Radio, where we have conversations that make a difference. We're committed to bringing you leading edge thinkers in the areas of environmental restoration, social justice, conscious evolution, and spiritual fulfillment. In our programs, we look for positive solutions to local and global issues that leave you touched, moved, and inspired to action. Our weekly guests include local and global experts and concerned citizens working together to heal the wounds that separate, alienate, and marginalize people. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to We Earth Radio. This is your host, Michael Stone. And today we're going to talk about this question: what if God wasn't some external being out there, but actually an experience of certain brain states where the ordinary sense of self is transcended? In other words, is it possible to have a direct experience of God? Here today to talk about that is Sally Ornstein. She's the wife of Robert Ornstein, who was considered one of the foremost experts on the brain, was an internationally renowned psychologist and author of more than 20 books on the nature of the human mind and brain and their relationship to thought, health, and individual and social consciousness. He's perhaps best known for his pioneering research on the bilateral specialization of the brain, continually emphasizing the necessity of conscious evolution to meet the challenges of the 21st century. He taught at Stanford University, Harvard University, and the University of California, San Francisco. And his books have sold over 6 million copies worldwide, had been translated into dozens of languages, and used in more than 20,000 university classes. He founded the Institute of the Study of Human Knowledge in 1969 and served as its president until his death in December of 2018. Sally, welcome to We Earth Radio.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, well, lovely. Well, you took this book on and finished it for Robert, and were able to get it out here, his final book, which I know you worked quite a bit on. In fact, you probably spent, a couple of years putting it together.
Well, I was, in a sense, lucky that I was in isolation because of COVID. So that was what I was doing night and day, and I kept my own hours, and it was perfect. It was a good opportunity, and I learned a lot.
That's beautiful. Well, let's start out talking a little bit about you and Bob and your relationship and how he worked and how you worked together. A little bit of background before we get into the book.
It really was quite, as I say in the preface to the book, Bob and I met, and we really, both of us knew that we saw what we wanted out of life, and what we needed to understand was exactly the same. I mean, Bob was uncompromisingly searching for truth. Mm-hmm. And I was too, and he had a better way of doing it because he was had written about it, which is how I first met him, through the first book, The Psychology of Consciousness. Bob was really an amazing mind. He would read everything, and I used to laugh about it, sort of like you could tell what he read today, because there were the detritus of books going through corridors and into this room and that room and out to the deck, where he would spend hours. Just basically what it would look like was he was doing nothing, but that's how he worked. Whereas I'm not like that. I will wake up in the middle of the night and get an insight about something, write it down, and then the next morning I have to talk about it. I mean, once I get it out there, then I can understand it and move on. So it was quite an interesting relationship, but he also had this amazing ability to come down to talk to anybody. If you sincerely asked him a question about anything, he would be so succinct and so clear and get you a book to read on it. And I mean, it was just perfect for me. I had a very, unlike him, kind of, for the generation of being a middle-class English woman, I was put in this convent school, and my sister, who was a goody two-shoes, used to go back to reunions at the convent, and on one of these reunions, a lady rushed up to her, and she was in tweeds, and she looked kind of homely. And she said to my sister, "Pamela, I used to be Mother Bernadette. Tell me, how is Sally doing?" so Pamela said, oh, she's great. She's living in California with a psychologist, and the woman, the nun said, and the saints be praised, at last there's someone to answer all her questions. So that's what life with Bobby was like. I mean, I would be reading something, I said, well, how does that work? And so then I got, for the book, for how we got into the book, I was reading about my own background, my own religious background, because I really wanted to understand how these things have a hold on you, even long after you don't believe they're literally true. They still sort of somehow have a way of still grasping you. And my mentor and friend Idris Shah once told me, if you want to understand how these beliefs and things, and you want to free yourself from them, you have to go into the background. You have to see how these religious traditions evolved and how they where they came from, how they were generated, and how they kind of became derivative. Or he didn't say that, but that's what they've discovered. You know, that becomes like a story that is in some of his collections by Nasruddin. And Nasruddin is this folk hero, and he has and a neighbor comes, that's right, a relative comes from the country and brings him a duck. So they roast the duck and they eat the duck for dinner, and he goes off. And then the next couple of days later, somebody bangs at the door. It's a complete stranger. And the guy says, oh, I'm a friend of your relative who brought you the duck. So Nasruddin makes duck soup. And then and the friend goes off. He's quite happy. And then a couple of days later, there's a knock on the door, and Nasruddin opens. It's another stranger. Well, I'm a friend of the friend of the friend who brought of the relative who brought you the duck. And this goes on interminably. And eventually the doorbell goes, and or the rat-a-tat-tat, and he opens the door, and he invites him in, and they sit down, and the guest says, but this doesn't taste like duck soup at all. He says, no, Nasruddin says, no, it's the soup of the soup of the soup of the soup of the duck. And that's somehow, that my relative brought, that's somehow the way I think religions have gone. The essence, the origin of the insight of the prophets and spiritual teachers is very much what we're talking about in God 4.0, these original insights. And in the book, we've tried to describe how not only what these insights were, in a sense, by definition, they're non-verbal intuitive insights, but we're trying to describe how this non-verbal insight, the only way that the prophets then could talk about it was in metaphor. So you get terms like angels, son of God, stories, storytellings that people understood were metaphorical, that actually once you absorb them, trip you into this higher consciousness, help you get to the other side, the more intuitive side of your brain.
Yes. Well, the name of the book is God 4.0, on the nature of higher consciousness and the experience called God. Yeah, just bringing up what you're saying about the we'll get into the different levels of God, but the whole idea of religion and how your story shows how it's watered down. And also a lot of that had to do with organizing people and power over people and justifying things like genocide and to use as control. So the power also watered down the original metaphors and stories and ways that people would try to show people that which couldn't be shown, especially through language.
Couldn't be described. Yes, right, exactly. I think that began, as we talk about in the book, in Paleolithic times, sort of when we first became modern man 35,000 years ago. It's likely, to cut a long story short, but from the research that we've done, that the majority of people did have shamanic abilities, did did have other insights. Otherwise, it's unlikely really that we would have existed. There were too few people, and you're in the ice age for 25,000 years, and you're a band of, say, 12 people. You need other perceptions than that, as Bob says in the book, was now taken up with reading, writing, cash flows, Excel sheets, whatever. You were able to put into that, were part of that intuitive perception. I mean, we mention in the book the contemporary shaman Bearhart, and how he describes how they were educated to sense the trees, the nature, and then to start to internalize that and to sense themselves, and they begin to perceive things that we've forgotten how to do. I think that basically we have it, but we don't use it, then we lose it, right?
Yeah, and so many of these too, well, several thoughts on that. So many of them were oral tradition, and also the writings were another thing. They're the oral traditions that changed to fit the times, more or less. Although I think you used the word presentism, looking at the past through the lens of now. You can't possibly understand what they're doing from that perspective. One of the things I think that's powerful in shamanism in that area is the idea of trance and of ecstatic dance, and the ways that take you beyond that normal level of consciousness. And I'm sure we're going to talk about the parietal lobes, and we'll get to that, and the default mode and those kinds of things. But just in looking at the historical perspective, let's talk about the God 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and the kind of evolution that you map out in the book God 4.0.
Okay, well, as I said, we start with the Paleolithic times, 35,000 years ago, when the spirit world, it was an animistic world, and that's, spirits everywhere. Everything has a spiritual entity. The trees are breathing spirits.
They're alive.
Yeah, they're alive. Yeah, but well, they are. It's okay. I mean, and again, but they were more, animistic cultures, there's so many more connections than we have in monotheism. It's just remarkable. Even now, I was in Shogbo in Western Nigeria, in Eastern Nigeria, sorry, and a snake almost bit me, and you've no idea the implications of all this. It bit somebody else, but there's this whole connections everywhere. People was, it was quite difficult to understand what in fact was going on. And then once at the end of the Ice Age, 11,000 years ago, you start the Neolithic era. People come out of the caves, and immediately there's more to eat. It's easier. Population grows. Then, of course, you need control. At that point, our original priests, the shaman, become more priests. They have to control, the elites start to control the majority. And they do this through these huge megalithic buildings that involve hundreds of people, and the celebrations and extraordinary findings that they found of the strategies that the elite had to connect to control the population. And it also, by the same token, it increased us. It's almost like a scientific revolution. They understood astrology because they needed to control how, how the sun goes through, then the solstice goes through into the graves below, and how if you go to the Hypogeum in Malta, there's it's a subterranean cave, and you talk through one wall, and it's amazing. It goes through all around, and it's just like you have this huge voice come at you that you is godly, it's like otherworldly, So they knew what they were doing, and a lot of they found again in Malta that these the doors are such to keep people out, was not to let people in. So they were very carefully orchestrating, just like the temples at Delphi. They orchestrated this. You get the feeling you're going through a cave experience because of the way the brain is wired. So integral to this is the understanding of the cosmos. That began in Paleolithic times, the heaven above, the land the land where we live,
Three levels.
And the crypts below, which we still have in our churches and
Yeah.
our mosques. You know, I mean, we don't lose these things, and that's what's very, very interesting. We are wired to have these transcendental experiences, and what the book is saying that now is the time, because it's only by getting out of ourselves, that normal small world self, that we will be able to face the problems clearly that we have today, which are global. It's only through developing this latent capacity, which we talk about at length in the book, as you see, you know, that we'll be able to come to the solutions that we can. It's almost like, you're looking at people say, come on, we could walk. Why are we all crawling around still? You know, so this capacity for greater perception is important. As Bob would say, the new mantra should be, it's not what you believe, it's what you perceive that counts.
That brings us to a big question, and I did question it in the book. It's not what you believe, it's what you perceive. So, you know, most people, when we talk about perception, it's like I'm seeing what's here. So what I perceive is what's here, but actually what we perceive is based in what we believe and what we have learned.
Absolutely. And that's the small world.
Right.
That is the small world. I mean, we perceive less than a trillionth of the airwaves out. So, I mean, that's what we're dealing with, right? We all have, and the rest of it, I mean, we have the basic biology. Otherwise, you couldn't pour a cup of coffee out into a cup. We're wired the same, but most of our internal life in this small world is caught up with our own interpretation, our own experiences. So we end up sort of in these, what Bob calls the Imaginarium, which is much to do with the default mode network, which we'll talk about later, where we're all, you know, oh gosh, what's he going to think of me? Oh gosh, I'm late for the kids for school. I got to pick this and I got to cook this. Da, 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 da. Oh, and I went there last night. Why did I say that? All that kind of rabbiting on, as we say in England. You just go, blah, 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 blah. All that stuff is pretty much has evolved from our own experiences. So my view of myself is very different from my sense of myself is very different from how you sense yourself, because we have both different backgrounds. But beyond that, what we're talking about in the book is to transcend that small world, which all religions have advised to shun the world. That's what they mean, shun this small, normal, confined, tiny consciousness and move away from it. Right?
The world of form.
Yes, and move away from it. And the keys to doing that, and to recognize that it's non-verbal is, and when you're talking about perception, to get back to what you said, which I've gone rather on a tangent to, but I was thinking today, it's really, the experience of it is different from, I'm perceiving this, I'm expecting this, and this is what I think it is. It's much more a non-verbal experience that manifests in action. So it's sort of something that you'd have an idea. You say, well, why don't we do so and so, or let's do so and so. No idea why you're saying it, but it works. Mm-hmm. And you can't say. I mean, you see it sometimes in sports. I remember seeing Magic Johnson back in the day. And he would be almost ambling along, and then suddenly he'd throw the ball behind him. Right? You think, well, how did he know Worthy was behind him and he had whatever, you know? I mean, and you know that when people get what Csikszentmihalyi called in the zone, right, in the flow,
or the sixth sense,
that's part of that continuum of towards higher consciousness. That's part of that intuitive capacity that we need to develop.
So how does perception relate to higher consciousness? How do you resolve that beyond self, that transcendence, you know, to get beyond
how do you sort of, what would, well, okay, I can only, as they say, you know, the ways to enlightenment are as many as the hearts of men. So it's just what I've understood thus far, correct? Right. Okay. Now, So the first thing I think that one really has to bring to mind is self-observation. You really, if you're going to want to overcome this secondary self, this moronic idiot that's constantly wanting to control you and wanting you to, making you want more or whatever it does, right? Mm-hmm. The aspect of the self that religions advise you to shun, I think it's very necessary to, self-knowledge is important. And how do you go about that? I think, again, Bob so succinctly describes that, probably better in The Evolution of Consciousness. I don't know whether you know that book, but when he talks about these many selves, which he calls simpletons, they've all got their own agenda. You see somebody, and when you last saw them, they behaved in a certain way, and up comes your little guy in the trolley who's decided, oh, I can deal with him, and takes over, and you think, why, when I meet that guy, am I always behaving like this? But it's, you haven't consciously thought, well, who's the me that's doing this? And so with by seeing these, I think the first time he wrote Multimind, I think it was in, and I immediately thought, oh, this is a splendid way to understand how to observe yourself, because you don't have to feel guilty about it, because you've got so many of these creatures all doing their own thing. So, well, I don't know, let's look.
Oh my God, when I'll use this one.
Someone says, finally, but through, you get to name them, right? Because they're you see them so often, so you get to name them. And I don't know, but I think eventually you kind of, they get weaker. I don't know, because you get strong, the observer gets stronger. Mm-hmm. And I think once the observer gets stronger, you've got more control over giving up this selfishness, because the prerequisite actually for developing this secondary system of the second system of cognition is that it's selfless. It's nothing to do with me first. It's the complete antithesis of me first. You're not going to connect to humanity if you're thinking about me. There's a lovely quote there's a quote I love from a Sufi called Bauddin Naqshband, who said, in order to know the relationship between the drop and the sea, we have to cease thinking of what we take to be the interests of the drop.
I love that. And I want to take a word out of that too. And that's relationship. Because when we're talking about the formation of a self and then self-awareness, well, how does a self get formed? There's the inheritance of the ancestral things that come down. There's the familial influence. There's the cultural influence. All of these influences are also very heavily influenced by early adaptive behavior.
Absolutely.
Did I get the nurturing? Did I get the love? Did I get the touch? Did I get seen and heard and felt? And in that aspect, we make up stories which create, you mentioned guilt and shame, which a lot of it is shame, because it's like shame. Guilt is, I did something wrong, so I can do something about it. Shame is, I am wrong. I am bad. Yes. There's something wrong with me.
Mommy was right. I did it wrong.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
That's one of mine.
So to try to know yourself, as you're saying, I think, as a therapist, that because we learn to co-regulate before we learn to self-regulate, right? Our ability,
oh, absolutely, yes.
Our ability to self-regulate is based on how we were nurtured and brought up. Mm-hmm. So in order to actually be able to see the self, and I'm getting back to the relationship part, we can only see it in relationship to others. And I think that's one of Bob's messages, really, is about connection, that it's all about connection. Somewhere you mentioned that the actual being able to see the self has to happen in relationship to something or someone else, so that we have those mirrors to be able to say, this is a self, and this is where I carry shame or guilt, or this is where I think I'm bad or good, or that, where we where we get all of those things. So that's a really important aspect of knowing the self. And that's, I think you're saying, the foundation from the ability to disconnect from normal consciousness and transcend into a higher sense of consciousness, if I'm following what you're saying and what the book says.
I think that it's all the aspects of that you're talking about are part of what you have to observe. And
Right.
you know that those are the guys that you're dealing with. Okay. But once you obviously everybody has bad days, but once you recognize there's a poor me, or I pressed the wrong button is one of mine, or it's like, oh, Mom used to say to me, it's going to be on your tombstone, I pressed the wrong button. But, there's all these people that, you just have to say, forget it. That's what I'm like. Okay, I'm not going to let it ruin my chances, if you like. I'm not going to let it inhibit me. And there's more to, everybody knows that this capacity is innate in them. I mean, look at kids, look at how they miraculously do things. They have no idea how amazing they are until somebody tells them, and then it starts to go wrong. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Or tell them it's not, or it is. But I mean, those of us who are, I paint, and when I'm rarely, but when I am there, it's exquisite how you can be in a timeless space, that placeless space, and create, and it can inform you in ways that you didn't know were anything you needed to know. I mean, I that's what I often think of when your people ask you, when you're in art school or somebody asks you, well, what's your content? And I would tend to say, if it's really working, I won't know for another bit. I don't know quite now. You know what I mean? It's again, you're not necessarily knowing, and like take poetry. I mean, people write the most extraordinary things when they're in the zone. They don't always understand what they're writing until afterwards. And, but that's this part of the brain. This second system of cognition is on a continuum. It starts with little insights of minor problems, and right up to, artists and Michelangelo, Einstein, Ramanujan, people like that, and then on with much discipline and effort to the prophets and spiritual teachers. I think those are the only way these prophets and spiritual teachers could describe the experiences, by talking about, as in 10th century, Al-Hajj said, I am the truth, and Al-Haq. He was saying, I am truth, right? And at the time when he said that was blasphemy, but he was doing it sort of at least for two reasons: to try to describe this nonverbal experience, but also to bust up this normal mentation, this normal way of thinking of the world. This is right, this is wrong, in this small world, to bust up that barrier, which we talk about a lot, to bust through, so that it's like the koan somehow, show me your face before your mother and father conceived you, or something. I don't know, one of those things. I mean, they're just supposed to bust up the way you normally think of things, to turn you over into that second system of cognition.
Well, let's talk about that. So first of all, we're saying, okay, you need to have a sense of yourself. And then in order to reach the transcendent state, you have to figure out how to go beyond. So right. There's ways that, should we talk about brain theory first, or just jump into the fact that we have to somehow, that narrative we call self has to be transcended. So something in the brain has to be overridden for us to be able to move into those higher states of consciousness. And you talked about the second system. Maybe we should start with that.
Yes, well, really, that's Bob's expertise, isn't it? But I'll have a go. I mean, but he does describe it very well in the book. Basically, I think the point that we're making in the book is that now we understand the neurobiology of that second system of cognition, how it switches into that. We are no longer attributing emotional connotations to it, because a lot of the time when you're over emotional about something, it's not where you want to be, because this second system of cognition is quite quiet.
Right.
It's again, Bahauddin Naqshband said, remember that perception and illumination will not at first be of such a character that you can of them say, this is perception or this is illumination. What we know neurobiologically is that there is this default mode network that is in the brain that a guy called Parietal discovered in 2001. And Bob describes it in the book as if at the end of the day, you've had a hard day and you lie around in your hammock but while you're doing that, all your thoughts that I was talking about a while ago, all those thoughts about what I said, what he said, what shall I do, the roast's burning, why is Harry always behaving the way Harry does, and all those social and self-reflectory aspects of you they have to dissolve. And once they dissolve, you start to move the barriers. And at the same time, he talks a lot about the right parietal lobe, which basically, when it's activated, keeps us in time, space, gives us the sense of this self that we're trying to get out of the way of. The right parietal lobe it covers an awful lot of aspects of keeping us in the world, keeping us in location. It's got a lot to do with mathematics, not the left side of mathematics, not the literal numbers, but the ideas of quantity, which have a lot to do also with spatial and time, keeping us in whatever this thing we call time.
So when you block that
when
right
that's
deactivated, you open up
exactly
a channel to beyond space-time, or
that's what they often, yes, people describe it as spacelessness and timelessness. There's no space, there's no time. I mean, I think it's poets do that. T.S. Eliot is a good one of that, and of course so is Jalaluddin Rumi. My place is placeless, my time is timeless. I mean, I think that's the aspect that we can develop, that aspect in which we can intuitively understand and have solutions to problems, because we're all connected, really connected, not just connected, I'm connected to you because you've got a nice smile and I like whatever else we build onto that thing. I mean, it's not that connection. It's a much more intuitive, but it is a connection, and it's built very much on the fact that, as Bob describes so well in the book, and I love this, it all starts when we sort of stand up and we're bipedal, and then we've suddenly got to be nurtured in the world. 75% of our brain develops in the world. So that connects us to each other, it must.
Right. It's spacious without separation. So that.
Absolutely. It's it's as if we were all one.
Yeah.
And everything was one.
Which of course is
I am me and you are. What was that Beatle thing? I am me and we are all together. I can't remember. What do you remember that?
Oh yeah, I definitely remember that. This transcendence that happens, we can cultivate that transcendence.
Yes.
And one of the ways that you and Bob did that was working with Indira Shah and Sufism, and talk about some of the ways that help create more of that spacious, interdependent. The Buddhists have a wonderful word for it called interdependent co-arising, that everything is related to everything else and is co-arising in our connection and interconnect. But how does Sufism, what are some of the ways that the Sufi stories, of course, but some of the other, like the twirling is another thing that I was always fascinated by in the Sufis.
Well, the twirling, one of the most important things about studying Sufism is it works in accordance with the time, the place, and the circumstances. When Jalaluddin was in Konya developing with his collection of people and developed this dervish twirling, he did so because they were an extremely phlegmatic bunch. They were emotional dullards, unlike us. So you wouldn't give us twirling because it wouldn't work. You just get nutcases. basically. and you're trying to develop something that enables you to be able to drive into in a different kind of gear at the same time as you're living in the world, working in the world. It's there. So you're trying to develop this adjacent to your ordinary life. Okay, so you're reading these stories. Idris Shah, who was the last, he died in 1996, I believe, but he left a body of stories, narratives, poetry that have this ability, are instrumental, are able to foster through the structure of the stories, they provide a blueprint which, when you expose yourself to them often, enables you to that blueprint to settle in the mind. So it's kind of like if you were learning a language, for example, or to ride a bike or something, you have to keep doing it, you have to keep practicing it, and finally, there it goes. You're suddenly thinking in French and you think, whoa, this is pretty. So when you're familiar with these stories, and then the stories, I don't know how to say, so it's like you have your own bunch of things you're constantly churning over, because you expose. I mean, I read them every day, so they're there, they just churn around, and then your experiences, your choices, your experiences come back and inform you more, and then you read the stories, understand more, and you go out, you do something, and then it just works like that constantly. But it's not something I can describe, because it's not
describable.
Well, I can say the easiest way for me to say is I'm incredibly lucky. That's that's what you get up feeling. It's like, goodness, how did that happen? But it's because you're constantly going back and thinking about things, and as you're studying more about how more succinctly to observe yourself and not to trip, so that you don't, because you can't have an experience unless it's for fun or thrills or peace of mind or whatever. If you really want to try and cultivate truth, a knowledge of truth, insight, how love, knowledge, all these things with the capital letters, what they really mean, you've got to keep pushing yourself out the way, and you might have something you think, well, that's the answer. Well, it's not, because you've got a long way to go before you find the answer, if there ever is the answer. You know what I mean? So it's a sort of, it's just feedback loop. I mean, I suppose you keep studying, you keep seeing things, your life goes on, and you find more areas in which you are useful. That's another thing, because key to it is service. Yeah. Key to it, every tradition, all the traditions, for example, what is it? I think it was, he who does not know about service knows even less about mastership, is one of the Sufi sayings. And I believe that in the Gospel of Mark, it says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be slave of all. So they know these people, they knew what was involved in order to get higher consciousness. And that's what they've always been talking about.
One of the things, a couple of things. One, I want to go back to spinning a little bit, because I just was thinking of, as a child,
you're hooked on spinning, yeah.
The act of transcendence is not a doing. It's more, from my understanding and my little bit of experience, is a state of non-doing, that there's a stillness and a quietness,
state of being,
in the state of being. And to go back to the spinning, because I was just having a childhood memory, and I'll bet you did it too, is as a child spinning around, and then falling down, and having this experience, which in a way is a transcendent experience. I don't know if you were a spinner as a child, but I used to get out of my not very nice ordinary reality and spin around on the grass and then fall down, and the clouds would move, and I'd be in this, I would call it transcendent state.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that's true. We have, as Bob says in the book, we all have these transcendent states. So we have these altered states of consciousness all the time. It's just we're not aware of it too often. But what we're saying is we need to develop it now, because unless we are all beyond, or we work beyond the self, we won't be solving our problems. We need to connect in a different way. We need to really connect.
Question that I brought in the very beginning here was, looking at, can we have a direct experience of God?
I personally think if I had a direct experience of God, it would kill me, because I'm certainly not prepared. You've got to be, it takes a lot of preparation to be a Jesus Christ or a Muhammad, or, it's not, I don't think we can treat that too lightly. But what we can do is we can find our place on the continuum, and that is much more worthwhile, authentic, and what we're here for than we do if we just stick around in our small worlds.
I think one of the things that's important, though, about that, like you said, we all have transcendent experiences, but the shift to God 4.0, as I'm understanding from your book, is really a shift from this external deity that we worship and that gets put into religion and structures and is used a lot to manage the masses.
Control, as you said, yes.
Control. But there's this, and I'm a longtime meditator, and that place in meditation, that those momentary glimpses of stillness, which also is timeless, because in those places, in those still points, when you really hit those still points, I don't know if you know the work of Otto Scharmer, the Theory U work.
I don't know.
So what he talks about is presencing and the emergent future that always happens in the now. So creativity, innovation, all those aspects of this higher consciousness, of this
of this intuitive level of perception. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so,
but it's not, but I think it's also, but to go back to your question of whether we could actually talk about seeing God, I am the truth, the light, the life, as Christ said, something like that, takes these are exceptional people, exceptional wise people. They aren't, and I think for many of us, you've got to be very careful before you. It's almost like, it's sort of like if you have the attitude of a child learning to walk, you can get it better. That suddenly it takes off, or as I said, learning a language, suddenly it takes off, and you are in a different, you have this other consciousness available to you, but it is on a continuum. So it's not like I'm going to say to you, the next step is that, whatever, I'm not going to be Muhammad or whatever. I don't have that kind of mission, but it is something that I think that we're saying in the book, that we can collectively communicate and connect together at that level of consciousness and be able to solve our problems. If we're all switching, if we're all approaching the problem from the second system of cognition, then when we're in that continuum, then we will collectively have the solutions to the problems we have today.
I have trouble with it takes exceptional people. Surely the people were exceptional, but if you look at the history of the mystic, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, and they were ordinary people. So many of the mystics had this experience that came through them, and most of them didn't have all the preparation and all the things. They just had a mystical experience. And when I say that's for extraordinary people, many of them had prayer and other things that they were doing, but to say that it's exceptional people, then it denies it's not me. Then where is this oneness that happens in this state of godness, this state
in connecting together in a community of the world community?
Right. So the self dissolves. So if the self dissolves, it can't be about extraordinary people because there's no self.
Well, exactly. But I mean, if you're I don't know. I would think the teachers and the prophets of the past. I've just read an amazing biography of Muhammad, and it's extraordinary what they went through, but still were teaching at a time when it's not like now, when really we have so much more information now than they had then.
But is transcendent anything to do with information?
Understanding of the neurobiology of transcendence, I think, makes a big difference to how you understand that experience.
It helps us to understand the experience, but it doesn't give us the experience.
No, because that requires work, and that's I mean, I don't want to go on too much about this exception because I don't think it's necessary for us all to become Muhammad or Jesus, or to be able to do what we need to do now. And that's the point of the book, you know, that we have so much more, that we can solve our problems, that we have this capacity to do so by forgetting ourselves, by, you know, and they've done studies now that really that talk about virtues and how virtues all have the same effect on the brain. They seem to, and they've done forgiveness and gratitude, I believe, now, but it's likely that's why, and there are certain people have said, I forget which Sufi it was, said, my humility is for its own reasons. You know, virtue.
Let's say another way, because first of all, humility, gratitude, being of service, all ways of letting go of self,
right?
Being other oriented, being more connected.
Yes.
And when we're looking at at least we can say, when we're doing the work that you're talking about, that you and Bob talked about for many decades, is that the work enhances our creativity, allows us to tap into an intuition that we normally in our narrative or story or sense of self would come up with, that intuition and ability to connect with what I would call the emergent future, to have a greater sense of the future, which then takes place in the present, that we bring the future into us through this ability to slow down and transcend the normal self, what we call the self. And that's a transcended state, right?
Yeah, but it's to talk about a state, I think, is rather than talk about a state, transcendence is a faculty that you've got. It's a capacity that you've got that goes along beside you. It's sort of like if you were riding a bike and you just got riding a bike, and then you think, I wonder where I should go, and you go and the direction's the right place. I mean, Bob used to say, you have no idea when this works and when it doesn't. How many times do you even quite simply just take the car and drive and you think, oh, I'll go this way? Maybe if you'd gone the other way, you would have had an accident. You don't know. You know what I mean? Because so you don't know. You don't understand the capacity. And I think it's really detrimental to its development to say, this is it. Because you must keep the doors open. It's not.
Oh, I'm not saying this is it. I mean, it is a space, like we said, of timelessness and spaciousness. And these capacities, expanding these capacities to be related and recognize our interdependence of all of life, we really need those now, because we're culturally, socially, and globally.
Well, it's really sad. I was listening to somebody, was that film that's just come out, that's the analogy of climate change with
Don't Look Up.
Anyway,
Don't Look Up.
That's right, Don't Look Up. And the director was talking, and he said, you know, this is and he rightly said, this is a time where we really need to communicate as humanity, and it's the worst time in our history of communication.
Right.
You know, because of all the things that constrain us to likes or dislikes or 140 characters or whatever. That's not, and what's holding us in this small world.
Right. So what I'm saying is that these skills are really important because we're going through an initiation, a cultural initiation or rite of passage, which is to move out of the fundamentalism, the literalism, and the, you know, all of the isms like that, and to tap into that deeper connection with all of life and transcending the anthropomorphism that we are so deeply in, that we're objects in a world of objects. There's a world out there, and I'm not connected to that, to this transcendent state where I recognize, yes, I am. There's a deep knowing, you know, this, you know, this cup of tea right here connects me to the entire world, to the earth.
Literally, yes.
Literally, yeah. I mean, literally, the earth that grew it, the people that grew it, the things that, you know, the sun, the rain, the everything is in this cup of tea, including what it took to make the cup, as well as the tea.
And that's analogous, right? I mean, you could do an analogy for that, couldn't you? To say this is the second system of cognition.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and I think it's important now because we know how to do it, and we could encourage. I mean, it's extraordinary. Bob, I think, has always found it very extraordinary, for example, that in the school system, you learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, but you don't learn who you are. You don't learn about human nature. You don't learn about normal cognition.
You don't learn how to think.
You don't learn any of those things. And so, how do you start? You have to start. You have to start by knowing who you are. You know, I think it's just crazy, and people want to. You know, the moment you start talking about it, everybody wants to know more of how we can solve our collective problems. We all see it as a collective problem.
I don't know. You know, in the Tao, there's this, I can't remember it exactly, but it's something about, and it relates to the self, but it says, I don't know who you are, but I'll spend the rest of my days finding out. And when we say finding out who we are, it's like looking for a closure rather than keeping the window, because we're always changing and everyone else is changing. If I know who you are as my wife, or I know who my husband is, or I know who my boss is, I kill all that possibility of transcendence. So there's a part that's about keeping the door open and cultivating not knowing, in my sense, to bring us to a place of transcendence. How do we keep that knowing, which, you know, knowing defines the circumference of our narrative and in our sense of self, which is always a limit, and transcendent is going beyond
that. That's what we're talking about. Yes.
Yeah.
Going beyond that, and realizing that, and trusting that you can, I think, and that you can develop it, and that it is our next step. I don't see how, well, Bob certainly didn't see how we could solve our problems without high consciousness, because it's certainly not going to happen with biological evolution. It takes too long.
And that's why I think it's not an exceptional individual that gets to that place of.
You're stuck on that. I mean, I think that those people who were exceptional then, probably exceptional then, is no longer have to be called exceptional now, because we're all endowed with it. We know how it works. We know what we can do, and we just have to get on with it. And we have to make sure that it's in our culture, this idea that you know, if you imagine from a very young child, you grow up knowing that you have a latent capacity you haven't used, and you see bits of it. You see it happen in creativity. You can push it further. You see that there's a function for logic and intellectuality and emotionality, but that isn't all there is. There's so much more than that.
We need to wrap up here pretty soon, but I think given the times we're in and the massive separation, alienation, divisiveness, anger, what's happening right now is really important. This disillusion of the self. Yes, know the self, but the disillusion of myself. How can I, Mark Nepo wrote a wonderful book and he talked about the two tribes. There's the tribe that says you're different, go away. And there's the tribe that says you're different, come teach me. And
that's think the barriers that Bob describes in the book. Thick barriers and thin barriers.
Exactly.
That he talks exactly like that.
Yes.
Exactly it. Right?
Yeah. The thin and thick. Yeah. So it's lovely to be with you, Sally. Is there anything last things? There's so much more we could talk about. The 3 stages of consciousness and mushrooms and LSD and being in the world of not of it. I think that's the key. Underline. Yeah.
That's the key. That's the key. Absolutely.
Yeah. So delightful to be with you. Thanks for taking the time, and thank you for finishing Bob's book and just getting the word out there and helping people to really understand that there's something beyond our everyday normal, what we call normal reality.
Well, it is an important issue, and so I was determined to finish it for him. And I encourage everybody to have a read. And if they like to read some of the teaching stories, there's some of them at the back of the book too.
Yes, I saw that. So again, the book is God 4.0 on the nature of higher consciousness and the experience called God. And how can people find out more about this? What is there a website that you
Yes, robertornstein.com.
robertornstein.com.
Yes.
All right. Sally, lovely to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We Earth Radio is an independently produced program supported by listeners like you. We are committed to bringing you leading-edge thinkers in the areas of environmental restoration, social justice, conscious evolution, and spiritual fulfillment. If you would like to receive our complimentary newsletter, The Well of Light, make a contribution, or listen to any of our past shows, go to our website, welloflight.com. Thank you so much for your commitment to a world that works for all life.